She was humiliated the moment she stepped into the reunion hall because of her faded jeans, worn-out boots, and braided hair surrounded by silk dresses and expensive perfume. "Emma, I thought you still lived in that trailer park by the gas station." The words sliced through the air like a razor from the old queen bees. "That hairstyle. Seriously? And she came back here." Another voice joined in, sparking a wave of cruel laughter. When a glass of red wine was deliberately spilled on her white shirt, someone whispered, "Well, at least it has some color now, right?" No one knew that the woman they were mocking only needed to stand once to flip the fate of the entire town they thought they controlled. A hush followed that volley of catty remarks, a brief lull as if the air itself paused to absorb the sting. Emma Reed felt the wine soak into the crisp cotton of her shirt, which had been freshly laundered that very morning in the worn-out washing machine at her father's old workshop. She drew a slow breath, mindful not to let her irritation show, though she could feel her cheeks turning warm under the glaring overhead lights. The entire banquet hall decked with banners displaying "Welcome Back Class of 2003." Fell silent glances bouncing between Emma and the cluster of high-heeled, perfume-laden women near the center. Emma recognized them at once, though they'd all aged in their own ways. Chloe Mason, wearing a sleek emerald cocktail dress, stood at the center with a nearly empty wine glass tilted in Emma's direction. The hush broke almost instantly, replaced by the snickers and sly glances that collectively said she had just confirmed their worst assumptions, that she was still that quiet small-town girl with no sense of style or sophistication. Emma's heart thundered in her chest, but she let her silence speak for her. She merely dabbed at the red stain that had already blossomed across the white fabric. Around her, the swirl of chatter resumed, though now laced with fresh rumor. Would you believe she had the nerve to show up in jeans? Some people never learn. She's still so weirdly calm, it's almost creepy. She tried to steady herself with memories she'd carried all her life, like how her mother, bruised by gossip and wearing an old coat with missing buttons, had once taught Emma that quiet dignity could be its own shield. As a child, Emma had watched her mother endure the town's pitying stares back when the Reeds had been rumored to be on the verge of bankruptcy. That memory gave Emma a certain steel she'd never realized she possessed until now. Clutching the edge of a nearby table, she examined the silver trophies arranged in neat rows, each engraved with a date from their high school days, football championships, track relay wins, academic honors. She recognized some of the names, including her own, as part of the second-place debate team, a memory overshadowed by the swirl of mockery that followed her presence in every hallway. Even then, she had been an object of mild ridicule, the shy scholarship kid, or the teacher's pet, depending on who you asked. A few steps away, a gaggle of men in expensive suits were discussing stock portfolios and real estate ventures. Emma caught a smirk from a bald man with a firm handshake, Derek Roberts, who once teased her for wearing thrift store sneakers in 10th grade. Now he was a real estate developer with investments in prime farmland conversions, as he liked to boast. Emma recognized the shape of his arrogance in the way he eyed her jeans as though their worn patches were an insult to his tailored jacket. Next to him stood Marty Henson, a local businessman who specialized in selling insurance and had cornered the market after old Mr. Lansing retired. Marty, puffing up in self-importance, gave Emma a once-over that left her feeling like a soiled doormat. She overheard a snippet of their conversation. "Honestly, it's folks like her who stay stuck, you know. If you can't even show up looking the part, how can you expect to get anywhere?" The venom in his words was subtle, but distinct enough to remind Emma how quickly prejudice could come roaring back even after 2 decades. On Emma's left, a couple of old classmates recognized her from behind, probably recalling her signature braided hair. They elbowed each other, a fleeting moment of nostalgia passing over their expressions before they remembered that the Emma they once knew had been the poorest kid in class. "Does she still drive that rusty pickup?" one asked, trying to appear concerned but failing to hide a sneer. Emma took a careful breath, counting to 3 in her mind the way her father had taught her when dealing with the agitation of a crowded room. The father who had quietly taught her to fix engines. The father who said one day she'd own something far more valuable than any fleeting brand name. She pressed her lips together and turned her gaze to the tall windows overlooking the small Midwestern downtown, her hometown's water tower, visible in the distance, shining under fluorescent lights. She felt that old tug of belonging, a silent reminder that she'd grown up here, that her story was woven through these streets far more deeply than these returning successes understood. The banquet itself oozed a kind of desperate pride. Tables were arranged in symmetrical rows, each covered in a linen tablecloth and a cluster of color-coordinated balloons. Displays of old yearbook photos graced the walls, including a massive collage near the entrance. Emma saw her own awkward teenage face pinned in the corner, overshadowed by the cheerleading squad's group shot and the football team's triumphant photo from the state semifinals. The latter was front and center, given pride of place. Everything in the room was orchestrated to remind them of their glory days, of the hierarchical ladder they once climbed in the cafeteria, or as Chloe Mason liked to call it, the foundation of who we are today. Emma suppressed a sardonic smile. Clearly, Chloe still believed that the peak of her existence was senior year, crowned homecoming queen, and most likely to marry rich. Indeed, she had done so, hitching herself to Greg Mason, the newly elected mayor, a man with a toothy grin and an even toothier ambition. Before Emma could find a seat, perhaps near the far side of the hall, away from prying eyes, she felt a presence at her shoulder. Turning slightly, she confronted Chloe's bright red lips parted in a mock expression of surprise. "Emma, dear," she drawled, swirling the last drops of wine in her glass. "I almost couldn't believe it when I saw your name on the sign-in sheet. I mean, you were so quiet in high school, who'd have thought you'd even bother showing up?" Emma said nothing, simply let her gaze rest on Chloe's manicured nails. They were painted a violent shade of pink that matched her lipstick, and Emma thought of the calluses on her own hands from years of farm work and labor in small workshops she'd taken up in her travels. Even her own father's workshop, where she'd helped him tinker with old cars, had left faint scars on her knuckles. She felt no shame in that. Chloe took Emma's silence as permission to continue. "You know," she ventured, "my husband is working on a big plan to redevelop certain parts of town, bring in new businesses, new life. He wants to modernize. It's so quaint, though, that you decided to come back." Then her voice dropped a notch. "But, Emma darling, you really didn't get the memo about the dress code, did you? Everyone else is wearing something, well, nicer." She ended with a pitying laugh that rang as hollow as a tin can. Emma merely nodded. "I like my jeans," she offered in a calm tone. Chloe blinked, perhaps thrown off by Emma's unwavering composure. But she quickly recovered, letting out a breathy giggle that signaled her entourage to close in. Emma counted 3 or 4 of them, all women who had once orbited Chloe in high school, feeding off her popularity, craving her approval. One Linda Carlisle had become a pharmacist with her own chain of drugstores. Another Samantha Green had ended up in Chicago, running an event planning company. They wore the evidence of their success, like badges, diamond rings, designer clutches, hair salon perfection. "Well," Linda chimed in, "I'm sure it's tough to keep up with the trends when you're... Where do you live now, Emma? Are you still in that little trailer park? Or maybe you moved into the library itself?" The jibe about the library nearly made Emma flinch, not because it hurt, but because it reminded her of the nights she spent reading alone in the local library, that quiet place that had been her sanctuary. She thought back to Miss Parson, the old librarian who used to slip her extra books even when Emma didn't have the money to pay overdue fees. Miss Parson had told her that knowledge was the greatest equalizer. Now standing in front of these women with their mocking voices, Emma almost laughed at the memory's gentle irony. She had built far more from those nights reading in the library than they would ever guess. Samantha took up the thread, eyes gleaming with a mixture of boredom and cruelty. "I remember you were always reading those big, dusty tomes, or daydreaming. Guess you never got over that. Heard you became a teacher or something in the next county, or was it a mechanic? I can't keep track." The group shared a theatrical little titter, each seemingly eager to toss in a line that might cut deeper. Emma merely shrugged. "Does it matter?" she replied softly. She'd known plenty of teachers, mechanics, librarians, farmers, and every single one carried more quiet honor than these preening socialites. But she kept that thought locked behind her teeth. Just then, the exclamation that had first greeted her, "Emma, I thought you still lived in that trailer park by the gas station," was echoed by an old classmate named Darren Perkins. He approached with a wide grin, though it lacked warmth. Darren had been an athlete back in the day, a wide receiver for the high school football team, revered for his knack of catching impossible passes. Now he sported a thick midsection and a voice that boomed with the shallow confidence of a man who'd never outgrown his teenage swagger. "But hey," he continued, ignoring Emma's politely blank expression, "maybe you moved on up like to an apartment above the old hardware store." A chorus of laughter followed as if it were the wittiest remark in the world. A searing flood of memories hit Emma, recollections of being teased for wearing the same tattered shoes, for never having the right brand of backpack. She remembered how lunch breaks were the worst. Half the time she couldn't afford the cafeteria's special meals, so she'd nibble on a peanut butter sandwich alone, nose buried in a second-hand book. Yet she also remembered the nights her grandmother would sit with her on the trailer's stoop, pointing at the sky. "You've got the entire universe in your heart, child," her grandmother would say, "and the small-minded can't see past the blinking neon sign at the gas station." That memory banished the sting. Emma steadied herself, focusing on the ornate candelabras flickering on the tables, noticing how they gave the room a theatrical glow. She felt oddly out of place in the best possible way, as though she were a traveler passing through a spectacle that would soon be gone. The swirl of conversation ramped up again, people boasting about their job titles, their net worth, their promotions. Emma lingered at the edges, letting them brag over one another. One man bragged about making partner at a local law firm, citing the number of cases he'd won. Another, the new manager at a tech startup, rattled off acronyms she'd never heard of, apparently proud of how impressive he sounded. Among them was Tom Mackenzie, who had once teased her mercilessly in math class. Now he was extolling the virtues of scalability and venture capital synergy, glancing sideways at Emma's unimpressed face. She got the sense that deep down his self-assured posture trembled on an unstable foundation. Maybe that was the difference. Emma's sense of self wasn't rooted in display, but in the quiet knowledge that she'd grown into someone her younger self would be proud of. The moment turned darker when Chloe glided back, her wine glass miraculously refilled by an attentive server. Without preamble, she raised the glass and then let it tip precariously in Emma's direction. It was all too obvious, even cartoonish, like a scripted moment where the villain sets out to humiliate the heroine. But there was no escaping it. With a flick of her wrist, Chloe sent a gush of red wine splattering onto Emma's white shirt, leaving a garish stain. "Oops," Chloe drawled, feigning horror. "Sorry, muscle memory from pumping gas for everyone. Remember, you were always helping your dad out at that rundown station." Another eruption of laughter filled the hall. Emma felt the hot rush of the liquid soaking deeper into her clothing, stinging her chest with cold. Cameras flashed. Phones were lifted discreetly to capture her humiliation, some old classmates even egging each other on to get a good shot. The laughter was deafening, overshadowing the polite music playing in the background. For a fleeting moment, Emma's composure nearly cracked. She could sense the raw cruelty in how they rallied around her discomfort, how the spectacle of seeing her drenched in wine fed their sense of superiority. Yet she merely took a napkin from the table behind her and dabbed at the stain. The white cloth came away pink dripping, but Emma's expression remained unwavering. The hush that followed her calm response was almost as piercing as the laughter had been. A few uncertain glances were exchanged. Some people perhaps feeling a pang of guilt at the cruelty, but not enough to speak up. Emma offered a thin smile, not in submission, but in a kind of quiet defiance. "Happens," she said, her voice soft. She made no attempt to escalate, no attempt to defend herself with words. The hush deepened as though the crowd waited for her meltdown, a tearful retreat, or a furious outburst, but none came. Instead, Emma merely set the napkin aside, smoothed her shirt, and kept standing. Only then did the mayor, Greg Mason, Chloe's husband, stride up to the dais at the front of the room, clearing his throat into the microphone. He was a handsome man with wavy hair and a confident grin, though his eyes lacked warmth. He gestured to the group. "Welcome everyone to our class reunion," he announced. "It's been 20 years since we walked these halls together. We've all made something of ourselves, right?" Applause rippled through the crowd, though Emma noticed it was mostly from the ring of people who had been boasting all evening. "We have lawyers, doctors, entrepreneurs, even a few local heroes." Greg went on, shooting a glance at Chloe and her entourage. He paused, scanning the audience for effect. "But tonight isn't just about remembering old times. It's about progress, about how far we've come and how we can all keep pushing forward." In that spirit, I'd like to share some exciting news about our beloved town. We're planning on demolishing the old southern block, yes, the rundown strip, near the edge of downtown to make room for a brand new commercial center. He paused again, letting the significance sink in. Emma saw a flicker of uneasy excitement spread through the crowd. "We've got big box stores interested, we've got chain restaurants. This will put us on the map, folks." Now, if there are any objections, I suggest you speak now, because come Monday, we're signing that contract. A murmur of approval rippled across the room. Those eager to see new development, like Derek, the real estate developer, and Marty, the businessman, exchanged satisfied nods. They saw dollar signs, new opportunities to profit. A few eyebrows raised, but no one openly voiced concern. After all, the mayor's confidence in the project seemed absolute. Greg waited, scanning for dissent, but found none. Then, clearing his throat, he began to turn away from the microphone. Emma felt her body move of its own accord, stepping forward. The hush that descended was thick with disbelief. Why would Emma Reed, the shy nobody with a stained shirt, speak up? She reached the dais, ignoring the cluster of stunned faces. Her voice came out steady, but in that quiet hush it carried clearly. "I'd like to say something." She began placing her hands on the edges of the wooden podium. The crowd stared, some with open mouths, as though the stage itself would swallow her for daring to speak. She glanced at Chloe, whose eyes gleamed with curiosity, perhaps expecting a humiliating meltdown or apology. Emma, however, had no apology to give. Instead, she slowly scanned the room, letting her gaze settle on each stunned face. "I'm not a CEO. I'm not a lawyer or a doctor," she said, pausing as a wave of snickering threatened to erupt. But she pressed on, voice calm. "I don't have flashy titles or designer clothes. I grew up in this town, same as all of you. I came back tonight for one reason: to pay my respects to the place that shaped me." She could sense the tension rising, murmured comments swirling at the edges of the crowd. Before anyone could interrupt, she added, "Before you sign that contract on Monday, you might want to know that I just acquired the deed to the entire southern block. My grandmother, as some of you might remember, was Harriet Reed." At that name, Harriet Reed, a collective intake of breath surged through the crowd. Harriet Reed was a figure in local lore, a woman rumored to be one of the original founders of the town. She had lived in quiet solitude, letting others take credit for expansions and developments. But she was also rumored to hold large swaths of land passed down through her lineage. The hush deepened, turning suffocatingly thick as Emma let that revelation hang in the air. "She transferred it to me this morning," Emma continued, her voice unwavering despite the adrenaline pounding in her veins. "And we aren't going to allow any demolition for chain stores." The effect was instantaneous. Murmurs exploded across the room, overshadowing the subdued background music. Greg Mason stepped forward, nearly tripping over his own polished shoes to reach the microphone again. "That can't be," he said, voice shaking with disbelieving laughter. "We've been in negotiations with all the right people for months. The city council said the land was open for sale. There must be a mistake." Emma turned to face him. "No mistake," she responded simply. "My grandmother always owned that land. It never belonged to the city. She had a handshake agreement with the council decades ago to keep it open for community usage, but the deed never changed hands. And now it's in my name." Faces shifted from confusion to panic to fury. Derek Roberts scowled, crossing his arms. Chloe's eyes narrowed, anger flickering behind them. Linda Carlisle dropped her phone, which clattered onto the floor. Samantha Green's face paled as if all the color had been stripped away. A swirl of half-finished drinks, plates of catered hors d'oeuvres, and half-hearted laughter lurched to a stop as everyone realized how drastically the room's power dynamic had shifted. Emma watched the fear creep into their expressions. This was the moment she had dreaded, and yet accepted the moment she'd have to reveal a truth she'd guarded for so long. Her grandmother, Harriet Reed, had not just been an old woman living near the edge of town, she'd been the actual granddaughter of the town's original founder. Harriet's father had staked a claim when the entire region was farmland, tucking away property in a trust that had never been fully tapped. Harriet, being a private woman, refused to flaunt her inheritance, and she raised Emma in a trailer, partly to ensure Emma never lost her sense of grounding. Even Emma herself had not realized the full extent of Harriet's holdings until years later. But she had discovered the documents carefully locked away on one of her last visits back home. And now she was the legal owner of the southern block, including the old library, the daycare center, the small church with a crumbling bell tower, places dear to the heart of the community, or at least what used to be dear before some of these people turned everything into a business scheme. Greg, stammering for composure, tried to force a smile. "Look, we can talk about this, Emma. Maybe come to some arrangement. The new development will revitalize the town. You stand to gain plenty from a sale. We can pay you a fair price." Emma shook her head, meeting his gaze steadily. "I'm not selling," she said, enunciating each word. "My grandmother's last wish was to preserve that stretch of land for the community. She didn't want it to become a line of faceless franchises. She wanted it to remain a place for those who needed it most, a place for family-run businesses, the daycare that helps single moms, the library that gave me a sanctuary. I promised her I would do that, so it's going into a nonprofit trust. The council can't demolish what they don't own. The reaction was almost comical. Chloe let out a strangled laugh, her glossy lips twitching with disbelief. Linda Carlisle pressed a hand to her forehead, dislodging her perfectly styled hair. Derek turned red in the face, fists clenched. "You can't do that," he spat out. "We've got deals, contracts, permits." Emma simply shrugged. "Permits for land that didn't belong to the city," she said. "So they're invalid." Gasps and murmured curses slipped through the crowd as eyes darted from one self-proclaimed success story to another. Emma noticed that some of them, the ones who had mocked her the loudest, were now the ones looking the most desperate. "Now hold on, Greg," Mason cut in, voice trembling with forced politeness. "Maybe we can come to an understanding. If you let us build on part of that land, you'll be compensated handsomely. Think about the expansions for local businesses. This benefits everyone." Emma's gaze flicked to Marty, the businessman who had boasted earlier about wanting to build a chain coffee shop in that area. He wore a pinched expression now, stepping back from the conversation as if hoping to become invisible. Emma took a moment to compose herself. She felt the eyes of the entire hall on her, the hush thick with tension and humiliation turned on its head. Even the people who had simply watched her get drenched in wine were now staring at her as though she held the power to crush them. "It's not about money," Emma declared, voice calm. "My grandmother taught me that a town's worth isn't measured by how many chain stores or big projects it can attract. It's measured by how it takes care of its people, the ones who might not have brand new shoes or fancy degrees, the ones who rely on the local daycare and library because they can't afford anything else." She believed that if you really love a place, you protect what matters. She paused, letting that sink in. The hush grew eerie. Emma could almost hear the quickening breaths of those who realized they'd lost their grip on a lucrative deal. So she continued the Southern Block stays, as is, with improvements that serve the community, not corporate interests. "If anyone here has a business or a shop that needs help, talk to me. But I will not let it become a chain strip. That's final." A wave of shock rippled through the gathering, many eyes wide in disbelief at the quiet woman they once dismissed, now commanding the room with a soft voice that bore the weight of something far stronger than arrogance, conviction. For a stretched moment, no one moved. Emma remained at the podium, faintly aware of the sticky residue of wine cooling on her shirt. She glanced down, seeing the blotch of red that had once symbolized her humiliation. Now it felt inconsequential, overshadowed by the magnitude of what she'd just said. She lifted her gaze to the row of old football trophies against the wall, thinking how silly and small those once colossal achievements now seemed. Finally, she turned to step away from the dais, noticing how the parted crowd formed a path for her. No one jeered, no one laughed, even the cameras lowered. The spectacle was no longer comedic, it was an upheaval of everything they believed about status and wealth. Before she reached the door, she heard Chloe call out in a wavering voice, "Emma, wait, you can't just leave." Emma paused, half turning. Chloe's face held a complicated mix of fury, embarrassment, and something that might have been respect. Your grandmother never told us about any of this. You just show up out of nowhere looking like that. And you think we'll just accept it?" Her voice trembled with a forced bravado that rang hollow. Emma gave a small, sad smile. "Yes," she replied softly, "because I don't need you to accept it. I'm doing what's right." Then, almost as an afterthought, she added, "Which I suppose is something we should have all learned in this town a long time ago." She continued to the exit, the hush trailing behind her like a shadow. Outside the hall, the air was crisp with a nighttime chill, the parking lot lit by dim bulbs. Emma walked toward her old pickup truck, indeed, the same one that had once rattled through town roads, though she'd rebuilt the engine herself. She paused at the driver's side door, her reflection in the side mirror catching her eye. She saw a slightly disheveled woman with a stained shirt and braided hair, but in that reflection she also saw the defiance of her father, the quiet perseverance of her mother, and the fierce generosity of her grandmother. For a moment she recalled a time her mother had been scolded in a grocery store for wearing a threadbare coat during the winter season. People had whispered, "She can't afford a better coat." Emma remembered the resilience in her mother's eyes, a resilience that echoed now in her own. She pressed her palm against the cold metal of the truck, letting the final traces of adrenaline subside. Inside the hall, she knew mayhem would break loose once the shock wore off. People would scramble to figure out how they'd missed this detail about Harriet Reed and the Southern Bloc. Lawyers would be called. The city council might try to fight it, but Emma felt secure in the knowledge that Harriet had prepared every legal measure, every clause, to ensure the land's protection. Emma's father had once told her that a small flame of hope could burn down an entire edifice of greed if nurtured the right way. She felt that flame burn in her now, an unwavering glow that no red wine or sneering remark could extinguish. She slipped into the driver's seat, turning the ignition. The engine growled in the comforting way she recognized from her childhood. Leaning back against the worn cushion, she recalled her grandmother's last words. "They'll only understand what you're truly worth when you show them you don't need their validation." She had proven that tonight in a banquet hall thick with the illusions of success. Her chest tightened with a strange mix of sorrow and relief. Even though she had effectively shaken the entire power structure of the town, she was leaving behind the final illusions of a place that had once rejected her for being poor, for wearing the same 2 pairs of jeans throughout high school. Yet, she wasn't leaving for good. She knew she'd be back to manage the nonprofit trust, to ensure the library got the renovations it needed, the daycare got new supplies, the old church could fix its bell tower. She was leaving only the ghosts of her humiliation behind. Driving out of the parking lot, she glanced in the rearview mirror at the building lights blazing in the windows. Her mind wandered to the revelations that might soon come to her old classmates that the worthless girl they'd mocked was heir to the very land they coveted. She hoped that in losing their claim to a commercial windfall, maybe they would remember that a town's roots should be nourished, not torn out. She pressed on the accelerator, disappearing into the hush of the Midwestern night. In the coming days, the story of Emma's stand would spread through the small town. Gossip would swirl in cafes and barbershops, mingling with resentment and, for some, a grudging respect. Emma would have phone calls to handle documents, to sign zoning boards, to confront. But for this brief moment, just after leaving the reunion hall, she allowed herself to be simply Emma Reed, the quiet child of Harriet Reed's legacy, guiding her pickup along a moonlit county road. She replayed the final words she'd spoken inside. "Around here, worth isn't measured by name tags or shiny shoes. It's measured by who's brave enough to do the right thing, even when the whole world tries to shame them for it." Those words lingered with her as she passed the dark silhouette of the old library, the steeple of the nearly condemned church, and the corner building that housed the daycare's chipped sign. Soon those structures would be safe from the wrecking ball. Soon they would stand as a testament to the town's heritage and to one woman's decision to protect what truly mattered. That night, Emma parked her truck outside the trailer she'd once called home, the same patch of land where Harriet's daisies still grew in wild clusters. She stepped onto the rickety porch, remembering how she'd spent summer evenings here listening to her grandmother spin stories about the founder's dream, about a town built on unity and kindness. She exhaled the last of the tension from the reunion. The memories of cruel laughter and spilled wine no longer had power over her. She was free in a way that none of those wealthy or well-dressed classmates ever seemed to be. She sank onto the creaking wooden step, letting the moonlight wash over her. Even if exhaustion weighed on her, she also felt a deep-rooted sense of peace. The old orchard behind the trailer rustled with the night breeze, a quiet lullaby reminding her that she was home. In the following days, as predicted, phone calls poured in from city officials and would-be investors. Emma navigated them with the same steady calm she had shown at the reunion. Mayor Greg Mason attempted to salvage the development, offering new proposals that might compromise. But Emma, guided by Harriet's instructions, refused any arrangement that would displace the community institutions. Some labeled her an idealist, others called her a stumbling block to progress. But for each wave of criticism, she found support among those who relied on the library for a safe reading space, the daycare for an affordable childcare option, the small church for community outreach. Over time, the local newspapers picked up the story, painting Emma as a surprising champion of the underprivileged. Meanwhile, Chloe Mason and her circle faced public scrutiny for how they'd pushed for a plan that would have flattened cherished town landmarks. Word of Emma's background spread, revealing that Harriet Reed's family had quietly held significant influence over the town's expansion since its earliest days. While others jostled for credit and wealth, Harriet had chosen to keep to the fringes, letting the self-important scramble for the spotlight. Now Emma carried that legacy. The swirl of revelations made the prior humiliations at the reunion seem all the more ironic. High school bullies who once measured success by job titles and designer suits now realized they needed Emma's permission to open new stores or remodel old buildings. Apologies trickled in from a few corners, though they were often laced with thinly disguised resentment. Emma accepted them gracefully, never stooping to rehash old wounds. She set up a small advisory board of local volunteers, people who believed in preserving the soul of the community. Every time she signed a paper or set a new rule for the trust, she felt her grandmother's spirit guiding her. The trailer no longer felt like a relic of poverty. It felt like a symbol of values deeply rooted in humility and compassion. As the weeks rolled by, the once sneering members of her graduating class had to confront their own complacency. Derek Roberts, the developer, grudgingly admitted that maybe there's some merit in keeping local businesses alive. Linda Carlisle. The pharmacist approached Emma with a request to open a small clinic for low-income families. Samantha Green asked if she could host community events in the old library reading rooms. Emma granted these approvals under the condition that they serve the broader public and remain affordable. Slowly, the southern block transformed not into a chain-laden commercial center, but into a revitalized area that stayed true to the town's heritage. Even the daycare got a fresh coat of paint and new playground equipment courtesy of the trust's funds. Chloe Mason, once the reigning queen of the class, found herself overshadowed by the generosity that Emma displayed. Where Chloe had hoarded influence through her husband's political connections, Emma wielded quiet authority by championing the vulnerable. It was a shift none of them could have foreseen during those high school years, when being the center of attention seemed the highest achievement. In hushed corners of coffee shops and potluck dinners, the townspeople whispered about how Emma, in her simple clothes and unassuming presence, had reshaped their future. Some came to appreciate that real leadership didn't always wear tailored suits or brandish fancy degrees. Finally, the day arrived for the formal dedication of the Harriet Reed Community Trust. Emma stood at the edge of a newly landscaped garden behind the daycare center, addressing a modest crowd gathered for the ribbon cutting. She wore the same faded jeans and a clean white shirt, this time free of any wine stains. The air carried the scent of fresh mulch and blooming marigolds. A local reporter took photos capturing Emma's gentle smile. She didn't make a grand speech. She simply said, "This trust is for everyone who thought they had no place to go. My grandmother believed our worth isn't measured in money or status, but in how we care for each other. Let's honor that." Applause followed, genuine and heartfelt. In the distance, she saw Chloe and Greg Mason standing awkwardly, hands clasped. Greg nodded politely while Chloe gave a small wave of begrudging acknowledgement. The dynamic had changed forever. Emma didn't revel in their discomfiture. She merely felt relief that the divisive plan to bulldoze the southern block was laid to rest. The highlight of the dedication was seeing kids sprint across the newly safe playground, their parents chatting in the old cafeteria area of the daycare as the caretaker explained upcoming improvements. For Emma, this was more meaningful than any business deal or fancy accolade. That evening, Emma returned to the trailer, climbing those same rickety steps. The sun was setting in shades of gold and lavender, casting long shadows across the orchard. She sank onto the porch just like she used to do with her grandmother. In her hands, she cradled a photograph, a younger Emma smiling beside Harriet, a battered library book in her arms. The memory tugged at her heart, reminding her that Harriet's lessons had always been about cultivating hope even in harsh soil. A sense of fulfillment washed over her, mingled with a twinge of sorrow that Harriet wasn't here to see the transformation. But maybe in spirit, Harriet did see it. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The trust thrived, and so did Emma. She'd set down deeper roots in the town, balancing her responsibilities with the same humility that kept her from brandishing her newfound power. She still drove her old pickup. She still wore her boots and braided her hair. The difference was in how people approached her now, with respectful curiosity rather than scorn. The library staff made her an honorary member of their board, asking for her input on expansions and literacy programs. The daycare invited her to read to the children once a week, a task she embraced with quiet joy. Even the church, with its newly repaired bell tower, occasionally rang out in the early mornings, a gentle reminder that a community must care for all its corners. The next time she encountered Chloe, it was at a local diner, unplanned. Chloe had slipped in for a quick latte wearing casual attire that suggested a shift in her own self-image. Spotting Emma, she hesitated, then approached. The moment was tentative, both women aware of their shared history of old wounds and new realities. Chloe said softly, "I owe you an apology. Several, actually." Emma looked at Chloe, seeing the strain in her expression, lines formed perhaps from realizing how ephemeral superficial status can be. She gave a small nod, not yet accepting the apology outright, but acknowledging the gesture. Chloe exhaled, her voice tremulous. "Back at the reunion, I'm ashamed. I was so wrapped up in the idea that success is about appearances, but now I see how trivial that all was. I'm sorry." Emma studied her for a long moment. Then with the same quiet dignity, she said, "Thank you, and I hope we can help each other make this town better." It wasn't a grand reconciliation, but a seed of respect planted. Chloe nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. As Emma left the diner, a faint chord of release played in her heart. For so long she had carried the memory of that wine staining her shirt, the sneers that followed the raw sense of being an outsider in her own hometown. Now she realized she'd done more than stand up against bullies. She'd given them an opportunity to see the hollowness of their arrogance, to rediscover a sense of humanity. The stain on her shirt had faded in the wash, just as the bitterness of those memories faded with each act of compassion she extended to the community. Some nights she still felt a pang of loneliness, remembering how as a child she had yearned for acceptance from these very people. But adulthood, combined with Harriet's legacy, had taught her that acceptance didn't matter if it came at the cost of her principles. One crisp autumn day, the class newsletter maintained by an informal group of alumni featured a big story on the Trust's projects. Images of Emma standing beside refurbished buildings and grateful residents occupied the front page, accompanied by an article praising her dedication. The piece concluded by noting how improbable it was for someone once considered the quiet, struggling girl to now guide the future of their town. Emma read it feeling a flicker of pride, but also detachment. The world measured success in headlines and accolades. She measured it in the library's new reading corners, the daycare's safe play area, the church's outreach programs. And that was enough. Eventually, a year passed since the fateful reunion. The Southern Block was alive with new energy, locally run coffee shops, community art studios, a small farmer's market on weekends. Emma heard from her old classmates scattered around the country, some sending messages of congratulations, others asking if they could come back and open a small business in the revitalized district. She welcomed them if their intentions were in line with the Trust's mission. Through it all, she never lost sight of the values instilled by Harriet or the quiet lessons from her mother, who once wore that old coat in the face of ridicule. She still lived simply, no mansion, no fancy cars, no designer wardrobes. And ironically, that simplicity was what made her so formidable in the eyes of those who once scoffed at her. One clear morning, as she strolled through the Southern Block to check on a new mural project at the library, she spotted a small cluster of high schoolers, likely a part of the next generation, laughing and snapping pictures near the painted walls. Emma paused, recalling how 20 years ago she had hidden from groups just like them, afraid of being mocked for her clothes or her meekness. Now, instead of fear, she felt a sense of hope. The kids beckoned her over, asking if she was the person behind the new trust that helped fund the mural. When she confirmed it, they thanked her, explaining how it made the neighborhood feel more alive. Emma nodded, smiling. She realized that in helping secure a future for this town, she had also reshaped her own past, transforming the memory of humiliation into a story of resilience. That evening, she returned to the trailer yet again, footsteps rustling the leaves that had begun to fall around the yard. She remembered how it all started in that reunion hall, the jeering voices, the wine on her shirt, the cameras capturing her humiliation. And she remembered the hush that fell when she revealed her ownership of the Southern Block. It was a turning point, not just for the town, but for her own sense of self. She sat on the porch steps, running her hands over the chipped wood, thinking about Harriet, who had orchestrated so much of this from behind the scenes. Maybe Harriet had known that it would take a dramatic confrontation for Emma to fully claim her heritage and her voice. The old orchard behind the trailer rustled in the breeze, carrying the scent of apples and damp earth. Emma allowed herself a deep breath, marveling at how life circled back. She also recalled the line she had spoken that night, which still lingered in local lore. Around here, worth isn't measured by name tags or shiny shoes. It's measured by who's brave enough to do the right thing, even when the whole world tries to shame them for it. That sentiment, repeated by townspeople who once dismissed her, might just be the new motto for this place. She leaned her head back, gazing at the emerging stars overhead. The ring of indignities she'd suffered in her youth felt distant now, overshadowed by a deep gratitude for the home she had helped reshape. And in that final hush of nightfall, she realized a simple truth: the ones who had humiliated her never truly had the power to define her. Their mockery was just noise. Her grandmother, her father, her mother, they had gifted her with a quiet strength that outlasted petty jabs and spilled wine. The result was a woman who stood for something greater than herself, and a town that was learning to do the same. Tomorrow she would wake up, pull on her jeans and boots, braid her hair, and continue working to ensure the trust served every family who needed it. She would do so with her head held high, the memory of that glass of wine fading into a footnote in a larger narrative about growth, empathy, and redemption. If this story stirred something in you, like it, share it, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, because sometimes the ones they try to humiliate are the only ones strong enough to rewrite the rules.